There are times when life's biggest challenge is to just keep going. Just keep going. I think that's one of the big challenges of life in a pandemic. Maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of us. You see, we don't know how long life's going to be disrupted in this way, and we're not really sure what life will be like on the other end of the pandemic. I'm reminded of the letter to the Hebrews. The author writes in the 12th chapter, there in the first verse, "Run with perseverance the race that is set before us." Perseverance is a crucial part of long distance running. It's physically difficult to run long distances, even when you're in the shape to do it. Running a marathon is really a strenuous physical activity. But equally difficult is the mind game, as it were, of running for a long distance. There's actually monotony. Running for over 2 hours, or maybe it'd be a whole lot more than 2 hours, is sort of mind-numbing. In other words, in about 10 minutes, it's going to be just like the last 10 minutes, which were just like the last 10 minutes. And I suspect that a lot of people who are staying at home, staying away from the office, homeschooling their kids, wake up each day with the realization, oh, this is just like yesterday. And tomorrow may be just like today and yesterday and the day before. How do I keep going? How do I persevere when I don't really see a clear finish line? That's one of the challenges of this pandemic life that we are inhabiting right now. We don't see a clear finish line. We don't know when it will be over. And honestly, we don't know what things will be like on the other end of the pandemic stretch that we're running through right now. How do we keep going? Perseverance is the spiritual strength to take the next step, especially when you're not sure how long the race is going to be and what the course of that race looks like and where that course ultimately will take you. Last summer, I spent some time reflecting on perseverance, not because I was having to endure something. I was on sabbatical and I visited a concentration camp, Mauthausen-Gusen, the concentration camp from which my mother was liberated at the end of the Second World War. She was just 15 or 16 years old when the Nazis arrested her and put her in that dismal place. It was a camp devoted to mass extermination, but not through gassing, instead through forced, exhausting labor and disease and malnutrition. So my mother was placed in this camp where she would every day awake with the realization that she would receive at most 500 calories worth of food. She would work 12 hours a day. People around her would be slowly wasting away and dying. She didn't know where her parents were. She didn't know she'd ever get out. Perhaps began to suspect that she wouldn't. And even if she did, what would the world be like that she would enter after exiting a place like this? And I began to wonder, so what kept my mother going? Now, we're endowed with a kind of impulse to survive. We want to have air, we want to have food, we want to have shelter, and we're driven to seek those things. But you know, and I know that some folks lose that will to survive. They are overwhelmed by the circumstances of their lives, and they just can't see their way through to the next step, and they die by suicide. That happened in those camps, but it was also the case that some people not only managed to survive, but they learned deep spiritual lessons, and they paradoxically thrived under incredibly adverse circumstances. I don't mean to say that they were happy-go-lucky or nothing ever bothered them, or they weren't concerned or fearful or struggling with a sense of the meaninglessness of things. But I do mean that somehow or another, some people, and I think my mother was one of them, some people were able to rise from their miserable beds and face a new day and just keep going because they found that life was worth living. All I can do is reflect on what my mother's life was like and reflect on other writers who survived the camps to have some sense of what gave them the power to persevere, and then to apply perhaps that lesson to understanding what the author of Hebrews was getting at and how that can help us persevere life in pandemic time. The reports that I've read, the Viktor Frankl level of writers that are Eddie Hillesum, who did not survive, but whose writings did. The reports I read from them have two important lessons. These two didn't agree necessarily on how they saw things, but let's see what one thing they did agree on. They again and again and again made loving an other, being concerned about the well-being of someone other than themselves, the focal point of their lives. You see, love is always about reaching out beyond ourselves to someone else. And the people who thrived, whose souls were enlarged even while their bodies were being diminished, were people who lived a life of love, who gave themselves as an offering for the well-being of people around them. I'm writing about this in my next book, which will be coming out next fall, and so I'm not going to go into great detail about it. So just keep your eyes peeled for Looking for God in Messy Places, coming out in the fall of 21. But the point I want to make here right now is that love is what made their lives worth living. Love of another, concern for their well-being. In other words, what Jesus told us to do, love our neighbor. And Hillesum in particular, who was really quite the mystic before she died, was aware of God's presence in even the bleakest circumstances any of us could possibly imagine. And so I believe that when we run the race and we run it with perseverance, we're not merely saying, whew, this will be over soon. I can see the finish line, so I can endure anything. Instead, I think what the author of Hebrews was getting at, and what those concentration camp victims have taught me, at least, and I think what my mother eventually taught me, is that life becomes meaningful. Each step that we're going to take today, life becomes meaningful when we take that step for the sake of someone else. When we live a life of compassion rather than self-absorption. That's where we actually feel God welling up within the depths of our hearts and our circumstances and other people's lives. The writer of Hebrews didn't say, keep going because the end is in sight and it'll all be over and everything will be fine and you'll go back to just the way it used to be before things got hard. The writer said, look, you're not alone in this. You're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We're in this thing together. And the way that we run, the life lived in love, will make that life worthwhile. You know, it's an illusion to think that you really know where the road you're on is going, even when times are great, even when everything was exactly the way it was before the pandemic hit us. We never really knew what the course of our lives would be. God has a way of surprising us all along the way, and life has a way of throwing us curves too. But what we can count on, and what makes that life worth living, is that God will always show up, and we participate in God's love for us and draw on the strength of that love when we make our lives about loving someone else, about making the world a better place, not just for ourselves, but for others. So hang in there. Keep going. As the author of the letter to the Hebrews said, run with perseverance the race that is set before us.